Hello, everybody. My name is Luca Raimondi. I'm a Marie Sklodowska-Curie Research Fellow based at King's College London and at the University of Witwatersrand, Johannesburg. And I work with Professor Ananya Jahanara Kabir of King's College London English Department, who is also here, on the project India and the Indian Ocean in the Early Decolonial Period, Archipelagic Imaginaries, 1950s, 1970s, in the framework of which this seminar is being organized. So we're gathered today for the first of two seminars that we are organizing this semester in the mini-series that Ananya and I inaugurated in the last academic year, called Archipelagic Indias. The series is hosted within the weekly series of seminars run by King's India Institute, which we thank for their collaboration and their hospitality. So the purpose of this mini-series is to take a view from the island and the archipelagic regions of India to explore geographies, histories, and points of view which are, from a geographical point of view, marginal to the peninsular space of India, but that, most importantly, we feel have been largely marginalized in the mainstream discourse on India. And so the attempt is somehow to try and explore what it could mean, deterritorialize Indian studies. Last year, we organized two seminars on the Andaman Islands and two on the Lakshadweep. And if you haven't, if you didn't know about them, you can catch up on the YouTube channel of King's, the School of Global Affairs. And for this series, we will explore the tidal geographies of the Sundarbans. So the adventure into the Sundarbans starts today with Sritama Chatterjee, who is giving a talk on ordinary ruptures, the periodical and print cultures of tidal environmentalism in Indian Sundarbans. A few notes to introduce Sritama. Sritama is a PhD student in the Department of English at the University of Pittsburgh, where she works on ordinary environments and aesthetics in contemporary Indian Ocean archipelagic writing. Her dissertation project was awarded an Andrew Mellon pre-doctoral fellowship for outstanding research and scholarly excellence. But Sritama is also a research advisor to Delta Lives, a collaborative public-facing community project which allows communities in the Sundarbans to use audio and visual storytelling skills to contest the mainstream narratives that circulate in the media about the Sundarbans. Sritama's talk will last about half an hour, 40 minutes, and it will be followed by a short response from Professor Ananya Kabir, and then we will open up for Q&A. If there are any questions that pop up in your mind during the presentation, you can write them in the chat box, and I will collect them and we'll make sure they will be addressed at the end of the talk. And also, if you must leave earlier, but you have a question that you want to ask, you can leave them in the chat box, and then you can catch up with the answer in the recording that will be available on YouTube in a week or so. I think housekeeping rules are over, so we're ready to start, and I am ready to let Sritama start our presentation. Yes, Ananya?
I just had one word. I wanted to say thank you to Vignesh on our behalf. Vignesh Rajamani, who's also hidden here, but he's put off his video, so we can't see him. But Vignesh is the person who, hi Vignesh, just because it's the first one we are doing in the mini series. Everybody, we've got quite a few people already in the audience, which is fantastic. But just to know that the King's India Institute runs the seminar series, so please check what they offer in any case, but within that we have smuggled in a little space for our archipelagic stuff. So thank you, Vignesh, for all the collaboration and smooth work behind the scenes. So over to Sritama.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kabir, for inviting me to this to this series of talks on archipelagos. I was attending this talk throughout last year, and I have learned much during these conversations. So also thanks to Luca for introducing me and for making sure that logistics and everything is in place, to Vignesh for setting this tech thing up, and to all the attendees today who are taking their time to listen to my feedback, to listen to my talk, and hopefully provide some feedback. So at the very outset, I would like to give a content warning. My talk has references to rape, sexual violence, and gendered violence. So I must alert you to that. And I have a three-part structure to this talk. So in the first part, I talk about why and what brings me to this work on the Sundarbans, the questions and the scholarships that animate my project. In the second part, which is a little bit, I talk about the environmental periodical as a material object in the Indian Ocean world. In the third part, I am talking about, which is the more substantial part of my presentation, where I talk about how I see my project contributing to archipelagic scholarship in the Indian Ocean world through an understanding of gendered violence in relation to aesthetic and narrative questions. So I'll quickly share my screen. Right. So my presentation today is titled Ordinary Ruptures, the Periodical and Print Cultures of Tidal Environmentalism in the Indian Sundarbans. In the January of 2021, I visited the Sundarbans. It was one of my many visits to the Sundarbans as a research assistant with the primary investigator and multimedia artist Bornomala Roy for a UNESCO-funded project on impact of climate change on women's health in the Sundarbans. During the course of our conversations over Muri and Chanachur, one of our interlocutors, Horibodi, told us about her winning a challenge with friends for Chanachur, which is like, a snack. The challenge was that she must cross the tempestuous Biddadhori during the rainy season from one bank to another. I could clearly see the excitement and happiness in Horibodi's eyes while telling the story to us. She described it as a rash decision during her youth. But who could resist the temptation of Chanachur? In another instance, she described how pulling up the mud and the silt from the pond caused her severe joint pain. Matha jhonjhon, pa kon kon. These are exactly the words which I, found her to be using. Second. Right. These two stories represent to me the spectrum of women's relationships with the environment in Sundarbans. The former is a spontaneous and very affective response to the river, and the latter a seasonal occupation of collecting mud from the pond that was necessary as a livelihood, but not always desirable because of the health implications. This conversation with Horibodi made me interrogate and reflect on two interrelated things. First, and this is crucial, as important as the narrative of climate change might be to the region in shaping women's lives in the archipelago, there is not always a causal relationship between climate change and women's health issues in the region. And I have the fieldwork to substantiate this claim. And second, as scholars, critics, journalists, and artists, if we are looking at an archipelago exclusively through the lens of climate change, we are erasing the livabilities through which communities who live in the archipelago know their home to be. Narratives of cyclone and climate disaster are certainly important lenses through which many of us who are not residents of the Sundarbans know the place to be. But when knowledge production and art is solely guided by these issues, As scholars, we are producing scholarship that devalues the ordinary and quotidian aspects of living in an archipelago. It is these reflections during my fieldwork about the ordinariness, such as winning a bet for a snack, or what environments even mean in the context of Sundarbans, that has shaped my primary questions as a literary scholar, writing a dissertation, hopefully a book in the future, titled Ordinary Environments and Aesthetics in the Contemporary Indian Ocean Archipelagic Writings. Fieldwork has shifted the ways I think and ask questions in literary studies, and this is also inspired by a book that I read when I started thinking about working on a project in Indian Ocean Studies, but which comes from a Caribbean scholar, Professor Shalini Puri, writing a book on Grenada and the importance of fieldwork to literary studies. So in the broader project, I ask that what constitutes the ordinary in the archipelagic text, whether in terms of plot, poetics, or genre. And second, what narrative techniques emerge when we encounter the violence of climate crisis in the ordinary environments of the Indian Ocean archipelagos. So this is roughly the structure of my dissertation right now. So part of what I'm doing in chapter 1 is trying to understand that what constitutes ordinariness in the first place, and if there is a way in which ordinariness can pose or radically alter our understanding of environmentalism in the Indian Ocean world. In chapter 2, I talk about Sundarbans, which is part of what you would be hearing today. Chapter 3 is about Underbans, where I take up prison and temporality. And chapter 4, which is, there's a typo there, displaced waters, which is on understanding migration poetics in Chagos. So what I'm trying to do is how each of these chapters, whether it's the Sundarbans, whether it's Underbans, or whether it's Chagos, it is presenting a particular vision and a particular understanding of ordinariness in relation to aesthetics. So for today, these are the two questions for today. What particular forms of the environment, both textual and material, does the periodical foreground? And second, how can ordinary ruptures as a theoretical category reorient Indian Ocean literary criticism in relation to gender? In doing this work on Indian Ocean studies, there are several scholars whose work has inspired me. I'm inspired by the work of Isabel Hofmeier, who is joining us today. So thank you for joining us. And your work has indeed shaped, especially on hydrocolonialism, and some early work on print cultures has gone into shape how I think about textuality, materiality in print. I'm also inspired by the scholarship of Camellia Dewan, who wrote an excellent book called Misreading the Bengal Delta, which is open access. And I recommend everybody to read the book, where she argues, and I quote, how the development industry tends to simplify the complexities of a wetland delta in ways that may exacerbate environmental risks and vulnerability of the people it seeks to help, unquote. She writes, my intent is not to deny climate change, but to show the risks of development projects attributing environmental change to climate change, even when it's not the case. And that, went on to shape how I think about, the very important qualifications and differences between environment and climate when it comes to researching on, textual cultures in Sundarbans. I'm also responding to Nilofer Kadir's invitation in one of her essays on Shilja Patel's Migritude, where she writes, the gift of migritude, or rather its decolonial lessons, then is to interrogate the litany of violence against women across Indian Ocean. Colonial and post-colonial histories, including the experiences of migrant women today, whether they're intranational or international migrants, often forced into movement due to economic and environmental disasters, unquote. As I move through the talk, I will refer to more scholarship that has, gone on to shape my thinking. But for now, part 2. In this talk, I focus on a specific periodical, Nimnogangeyo Sundarban Sanskriti Potro, Lower Gangetic Sundarbans Cultural Letters, published between May 2002 to June 2006. I could access 6 issues of the periodical, which had the same, organizational structure in terms of content: editorial column, regional history and folk culture, poetry, short stories, and archaeological and ancient history. Priced at INR 25 to gradually moving up to INR 35, the rules for open submission of each issue was found at the back cover of each periodical. One particular rule of submission that caught my attention was submission rule 2. No political writing would be considered for acceptance, which was quite a strange thing for a periodical to say. But the cover image of each of the issues of the periodical featured a generic image, but also one that is easily identifiable with the region. So for instance, a temple, paddy fields with women working in the fields, boats on the river, archaeological objects, a pair of pelicans, and a not-to-scale map of the rivers in the delta. When I came across these periodicals dedicated to the study of a particular part of the archipelago, I noticed that the pages were foxed. To introduce my audience to the concept of foxing, book historian Joshua Calhoun writes, foxing is a 19th century word for some combination of brownish and reddish and possibly yellowish spots on paper. Foxing is useful as an aesthetic, broadly descriptive term that calls attention to staining that is caused by the varied, dynamic interactions of paper materials and storage environments. So I would talk about how I got access to it, but this is one of the pages where I found that the page was actually foxed. And if you see this particular aspect, so when I saw this periodical, they were not like separate issues that I could find, but instead what I found was that there were 6 issues which were all bound together and they were kept in one place. So I actually do not know what it looked like in its initial form and initial stage, but because this is essentially is a practice or a form of jugaad where 6 kind of periodicals are put together in one place. This is a very common feature across South Asia, so I wouldn't like ponder or like think too much about it, but maybe because the pages have been foxed, there is something to think about or reflect. Sorry. Without an actual chemical and material study of the paper, I cannot ascertain the reasons behind what led to the foxing of the paper. But what was interesting to me is that the foxed pages of the periodical about an archipelago that is facing environmental and climatic changes can open up questions about the matter and materiality of the periodical. The eco-annotation, to use Calhoun's term, as a form of evidence to understand the scope and gravity of environmental violence on the paper. As a theorist of the Indian Ocean world, I make the claim that paying attention to matter, presence, and understanding of the environment, that in the longer term could be a contribution of Indian Ocean literary studies for an empirical understanding of environmental justice. This empirical understanding through the textual materiality of the pages of the periodical is a necessity. We cannot fight what we are up against without knowing what the scale of what we are dealing with. For a literary scholar like me, the page of the periodical is the archive to understand the causal relationship, if any, between climate change, environmental factors, and foxing. At a more theoretical level, I read the foxing as an ordinary rupture because the periodical makes us pause and note the problems of investigating ordinary environments through aesthetics, while remaining attentive to the context and the conditions that lead to the creation of these ordinary environments in the first place. Methodologically, this task of understanding foxing is an interdisciplinary endeavor. And therefore, to the Indian Ocean Studies scholars who do not take literary studies seriously, it is time you do, because you need us to understand the implication of these environmental ruptures for understanding environmentalism in the Indian Ocean world. It is my, sort of interest in the matter and materiality of the text, which also translates to issues of matter and materiality across bodies of people who live and inhabit the islands, but also not always in an ethnographic way, but more through at the level of narrative. Like, what is it that narrative contributes to the study of matter and materiality? And it is through this this understanding of matter and materiality and human bodies that I now turn. So, the third section of the talk, which is like the more, substantial portion of my talk, where I talk about gender and violence, is basically a study of 3 short stories that I found within this periodical. So there are other genres, and there's a lot to be said about that. And I hope that eventually I will have the time to think and process about what it can say about matter and materiality at large. But for now, I am, choosing to concentrate on the form of the short story itself. So gender and environmental periodical. In one of the short stories titled Borsha Elo Khora Niye, which roughly translates into Monsoon Arrives with Drought, from the periodical dated July to August 2003, the oral legends from the Delta permeate the short story. The particular oral legend that I'm referring to encapsulates how the multi-species presence in the region is whipped with tidal geographies and time in a way that complements each other's presence. For instance, Bormon, who's the writer of the story, refers to how one of the characters in the story, Nishikanto, hears the cries of the cuckoo, it's a bird, poot poot at night, signaling the arrival of the high tide. According to the oral legend, the cuckoo birds used to be fisher folks in their previous life, where their child got swept away by the high tide when they had gone away for their livelihoods. The mother of the cuckoo bird was the first to notice that the child was being swept away, and as a sign of danger screamed poot poot to the ultimately unsuccessful in rescuing the child. Thereafter, the high tide always bothers the birds, and they use their sounds to intimate others of their arrival. The mention of the cuckoo birds come in the early part of the story, when Nishikanto mentions that previously he could hear the arrival of the high tide, but the construction of the embankments on the Piali River does not allow the high tide to be visible or felt. The way I read the legend and Bormon's incorporation of it in the story is that of an early warning in the story of what is about to come. Nishikanto is about to lose her daughter Borsha, and one of the reasons why Borsha's desperate cries for help in the story could not be heard is because of the constructed embankments that prevents her voice from reaching others. Intense sound, the lack of it, or the limits of human body to respond to that sound becomes an embodied way of registering gendered violence. Whether it is the boatman not taking the muffled voices that they had heard in the abandoned lodge seriously, or a car suddenly arriving at the middle of the night and leaving almost instantly, kidnapping Borsha and then transporting her would not have happened if the sound, a central component of this narrative, would have prompted a reaction in the people around the area of occurrence. Incidentally, it's also a constable eavesdropping into a conversation between the perpetrators and the senior police officials and being able to catch only fragments of the conversation that implicates the involvement of the police in this violent act. In the narrative, Borsha's kidnapping is not directly articulated, but it is always through the sounds heard in the narrative that violence is made legible in the narrative. Borsha's disappearance and the gendered violence in the story is also linked to the apathy and indifference of the police officials. And I quote, and this is my translation, 17-year-old girls do not disappear. They elope. Wait for a day or two, and you will find her coming back home married to someone. Do not worry the police about such ordinary matters. The police has more significant and urgent work to do than these trivial matters. Following this exchange, and after desperate plea, all that the police does is to record the incident as a missing case with no investigation or further search. The exchange above is one that calls for analysis. The casualization of disappearance, which could well have been a case of gendered violence, is dismissed under the pretext that the girl could have left home herself. A commonplace occurring elopen in the context of Sundarbans, which is also linked to economic and social factors such as limited access to education and poverty, is used to veil a serious incident such as disappearance. As one of the constables working in the police station later reveals, that the senior police officer were aware of the kidnapping and subsequent trafficking of Borsha in the city, but bribery and corruption ensures that the case is not investigated. The history of the gender violence in the Sundarbans need to be contextualized amidst a longer history of the violence of landowners, the Jodhars, against the peasants, resulting in the Tebhaga movement. The casualization of land-based violence and gender oppression is well documented. But to comprehend the scale of violence against women requires a historical understanding and a contextualization of contemporary violence against a broader plot of the landowning class. In fact, in the story, the protagonist Borsha is kidnapped and trafficked by the Dattas, who are technically no longer the landowners, but still collected tax and crops in the story. There is a longer history of violence being casualized in the region. And what the story does is resorting to the aesthetic device of opacity or illegibility to foreground this casualization. The ending of the story is significant for its commentary on how the topography of the delta mirrors Borsha's life story. 3 years post the disappearance of Borsha, the paddy fields in the delta were significantly affected by drought with no sign of rainfall, while the farmers had to face disastrous consequences for no crop. It is exactly at the end of the story that Borsha, Nishikanto's daughter, returns with her child named Khora, the Bengali for drought. The abrupt ending of the story leaves the story open to speculation and questions that are not mine, but one that I can apprehend being asked of Borsha. What happened to her after she was kidnapped? If Borsha comes back home after those who had enabled in her kidnapping promises to her father that she would be back, why was it not possible to bring her back earlier? What the story does in terms of aesthetics is in fact a form of opacity in practice. Opacity has a longer history in post-colonial criticism, but in the context of the story, Glissos's formulation of the right to opacity is the one that I find most valuable for the discussion of gender and environmental justice. The fundamental argument of Glissos in the chapter 4 opacity is that already dispossessed communities who inhabit marginal locations do not need to make themselves always legible to Eurocentric framings of transparency. The primary takeaway from Glissos is that one does not need to have completely comprehended the other to be in solidarity, end quote. I recast this line of thinking in the context of Indian Ocean archipelagic criticism about the right to opacity to show that Borsha Khorani, the story, through its insistence on not conforming to colonial forms of evidence formation that expect geographies and violence to be made legible. The problem of legibility is a twofold issue. It is one thing to be intentional about not talking about gender violence because it is traumatic. But on the other hand, illegibility can also be read as non-acknowledgement of the violence. My own reading of the story is the former. There are clues and hints throughout the story of child abuse and marital rape. Opacity is a key component of ordinary ruptures precisely because through its non-articulation, it is signaling that literary studies offers a way to understand gender justice in an archipelago, but the narrative offers enough clues about what has happened, but also does not make it sensational. Next, from opacity, I move on to excess and morality. In yet another short story from the periodical, Ganga Snan, the protagonist, Ganga, is trafficked by one of her family members, her aunt, Shoilomashi, and forced in doing sex work that she cannot get out. The circumstances forcing Ganga to take up sex work unknowingly is the poverty of her own family. Her father was a honey collector who barely survived after a brutal man-tiger encounter, and her mother, during the course of searching for her husband, lost life in the river. The family had no income and barely survived on the food that Ganga foraged in their neighborhood, making her even more vulnerable to the target of traffickers. Similar to the previous story, sex work is never directly mentioned or referenced in the story. Sex work is understood only through exaggeration, excess, and morality. For instance, the expensive jewelry or the excess makeup that Shoilomashi and the woman who left the village wore, or when the women advised Ganga to take a dip in the river Ganges to purify her sins at night. Sex work is suggestive in the story. What is interesting to me is more than the question of non-consent or tracing the relationship between poverty and sex work in the archipelago, the story chooses to understand environment not in terms of systemic underdevelopment of the archipelago or the human and non-human encounters, but through the lens of morality. For example, at the end of the story, Shoilomashi drowns in the river while taking a bath in the Ganges, which Ganga interprets as, nature punishing her for her deeds. The end mirrors the beginning of the story, where Ganga's mother had refused to comply with her father's instruction of taking Ganga for a bath because her child has not committed any sins that she needs to take a bath at the Ganges. Excess or morality is in fact not reparative by any means, because it puts the onus on the individual rather than investigator, a broader collective of social factors. But excess is a narrative feature of the text. Third, caste and violence. One of the particularly interesting short stories in the periodical is the story Shikar, or Hunting, by Pradip Kumar Bormon. The story encapsulates a narrative of a man-eater who is particularly fond of the meat of cows. As the story progresses, the reader realizes that the story is in fact an allegory of a Brahmin priest in the temple who harasses women who come to him seeking for a miracle, whether it's curing an illness, wanting to get pregnant, or appeasing Bono Bibi so that there are no more tiger attacks in the village. In the end, the priest is killed by two of the women whom he has harassed, one of whom happened to be his Sevadasi for many years, and the crimes becomes easy to mask because it is portrayed to be a job of the tiger. This supposedly fairly straightforward narrative is one of the instances where caste violence in relation to gender is centered. And here, while talking about caste in the Indian Ocean world, I'm thinking of Dr. Kabir's work on the special sort of spatial understanding of caste in literary studies, where she's talking about how the Thinnai often functions as a kind of regulatory threshold. So I found that very provocative and very interesting to think about caste in the Indian Ocean context. So anyway, to get back to caste. This supposedly fairly straightforward narrative is one of the instances where caste violence in relation to gender is centered. The human-non-human encounter provides an opportunity in the story to understand caste-based violence and patriarchy in the archipelago. The Brahmin priest's atrocity over the years comes to foreground only when Durga, one of those women violated by the priest, stages a refusal to visit him, because she thinks that Bono Bibi would not accept the prayers from a priest who harasses women. The human-non-human encounter also allows for the women to form solidarity and a form of interruptive feminist intimacy, though not radical, and I can talk about why it's interruptive but not necessarily radical, that counters patriarchal and caste-based gender violence. So the understanding of environment in the story is one that is built on a continuous and an understanding of slow gendered violence, where the granularity crossing of borders of the tiger and the subsequent narrative of the women wanting to offer prayers to the deity Bono Bibi is what brings caste to the foreground. It is the exchange of words, gossip overheard generational exchanges, that enables the violence to be registered in fictive terms. To be clear, I'm not hierarchizing gendered violence here, but the key question for us to grapple with is to think about how the materiality of the archipelago results in the operation of violence in such insidious ways that it is challenging to register this in aesthetic and fictive terms. Precisely because the ordinariness of the environment does not have the spectatorial dimension, it is challenging to render this in fictive form. I'm thinking about Pablo Mukherjee's work on what constitutes environment in the first place, and his discussion of the tropes of unevenness and the materialist critique of environmental literature emerging from India. If I may say that one way to understand materialist criticism in relation to environment and gender is to think about these three strategies that I just spoke about. One, first, opacity. Second, excess. And third, intimacy. So what the periodical, not periodical as a whole, but maybe like contents and stories within it does, is to think of a more productive way to engage with archipelagic crisis and consider the possibilities that Indian Ocean literary studies open up when we look at environment through the lens of the ordinary. My aim is not to romanticize the ordinary and also to consider the limitations of the ordinary as an aesthetic and political category. I am particularly inspired by a sentence that Veena Das writes in her latest book, Textures of the Ordinary. The forms that the labor of criticism must to some extent grow from the disappointments of the everyday. Therefore, what I'm interested in doing and what I've tried to do in, I would say, very broad and sketchy ways in this talk is to develop a method of environmental literary criticism in the Indian Ocean world that is attentive to the ruptures and the disturbances that the environments create, and yet it inspires the possibility of care and repair. For instance, opacity, excess, and intimacy, they offer an understanding of feminist methodology in the Indian Ocean at the level of narrative interventions, as well as something that we can potentially tap into to think about larger questions of environmental justice. I'm thinking of Lauren Berlin today. She's writing about something called crisis ordinariness. The urgency, and she writes, the urgency is to reinvent from the scene of survival, new idioms of the political and of belonging itself, which requires debating what the baseline of survival should be in the near future, which is now the future we are making. I would like to recast the sentence for my work to know more about how archipelagic writings can produce a vocabulary of survival, but also go beyond that to formulate an understanding of a future that is more than survival. This task of imagining livability and life worlds through the prism of ordinary ruptures is one that I find very crucial for the times that we are living in. I would end my presentation and leave you with this one final image that I just can never get out of my mind. So, as you know, during the course of introduction, when Luca was introducing me, he was referring to a project that I'm part of, Delta Lives, with my colleague Barnamala Roy and several others. And this particular, book binding cover is a representation of what happens when storms break out and how they kind of like come close together to make sure that the water doesn't interrupt and get inside. And this is done on textile, on a handkerchief, but that can also be used as a book cover. So even when, my understanding is that when they're talking about something so violent and something which touches them on an everyday basis, they always find a way to craft it and being able to come up with that language or vocabulary of livability. So in a broad and major way, I think what my project is interested in doing is that Ordinary Ruptures is about finding that model of livability, that model of environmentalism, which is not exclusively understood through the lens of climate violence alone. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Sritama, for your talk, your presentation. It was really interesting, also very interesting to see, to hear stories that otherwise would not come to us, at least linguistically speaking, and the knowing of a periodical that we knew, I think most of us, nothing about. I have quite a few questions on that if we have time. But I will, before opening up to the Q&A, I will leave Ananya some time for her response.
Thanks, Luca. But of course, thank you, Sritama. That was really quite an amazing presentation, very ambitious. And, I can see that I follow you on social media, and I know that you often express your headaches with your PhD, but I think I can see why it's totally self-inflicted. You are doing something really quite, unusual. And it's the kind of bringing together all these different dimensions, which you are in the middle of, you're in the thick of. I'm happy that we get a glimpse of it, because I think the conjunctures you're trying to make, the convergences you're trying to trace are really very productive. So I'm, what is this? Is this the middle? Are you in your, I know the timings are different in the US system, but are you in your final year, or, where are you at with the work?
I'm not in my final year.
I
have maybe a year and a half. This chapter is due soon, but not too soon, thankfully, because it needs some time to flesh out. But yeah, I'm done with my Chagos chapter. So this is actually the second chapter I'm writing, which is I'm most excited about, but also something I find very challenging.
Well, I mean, that's why I asked actually about the time, because it's quite clear that this is work that you're wrestling with, and it's absolutely the time to be wrestling with it. You're really in the middle of your timeline towards in fact, the early part of the middle, if I may say so. So I think I'm really happy that you chose to share with us this work, because this is also a time that one feels, I think, particularly vulnerable. Is it all there? Am I making sense of it all? Is it even sounding like it's adding up? So I'm just going to make a few comments, which I hope will help you push the material further, and there will be questions that I'll ask, but I'm sure they're really a nice audience we have. I'm so happy people came, it being Valentine's Day and all. So, thank you for joining us. And I want to give everybody a chance to engage with you. For me, I think what was actually quite striking was your attempt to kind of line up a few things that are not often thought at the same, together. Firstly, you made a very strong call. You, at some point early on, you said that, literary studies, literary critical approaches, we can bring certain things to the world of the Indian Ocean. And, this is something you're trying to do. And I think it's extremely laudable to be able to say that straight on. And what I found you were doing, and of course, you mentioned Isabel Hofmeier's work there, somehow negotiate between materiality, the materiality of print and the materiality of the environment that you were focusing on. And this, of course, is a kind of convergence that I think literary critics, we want to do. We kind of get trained to pick up these sometimes metaphoric sounding, sometimes metonymic sounding associations, but they do enable us to think theoretically, and so you are trying to look at these different materialities. And then you began with this idea of foxing, which again, I think was a very good way of showing how a certain kind of a training can introduce a completely new vocabulary and a new sensibility to a field, in this case, the field of the Indian Ocean, world. And you are, saying that this is a word that is familiar from book history and, all kinds of other, print culture, other kinds of domains of scholarship, and you find it very productive. And indeed it is, because it's literally the deposit of the environment on the surface of the page. And this can give us certain kinds of clues to literally, again, calibrate, how does the environment touch, the print surface, but perhaps in turn, what can surface, tell us about that environment? So I thought that was really productive. I'm hoping that this is a thread that maybe you'll pull through your chapters, or maybe you find the material literally of the Sundarbans the best way to kind of, enter this question of this kind of mutual reading of materiality, and how it's like these deposits of foxing give you a way to do that. Now, what I also thought was quite, extremely important was the whole, again, the gender, the reading of the gendered angle that you wanted to bring into all this, which was a way, if I'm not mistaken, for you to actually, again, enunciate what is the ordinary and what is its rupture, in this context. So I thought that was very fruitful. And again, doing this reading through these short stories that you've unearthed in this very, very kind of local, material, local kind of a journal, if you like, magazine. I thought it was very interesting that the names of the women were all to do with weather and water effects and rivers and so on, so obviously, with Ganga and Porsha and, so I thought that was kind of, an obvious, perhaps too obvious comment, but I thought, especially for the non-Bengali speakers, it might be quite interesting to draw attention to the fact that there are all these, I don't know, all these meteorological and, and fluvial, gestures, even in the naming. The biggest question, though, I had, because there are so many interesting points of this nature that I could go on about, but what I really want to do is ask you one big question, and kind of just try to map that against some books that I'm reading right now. And so, there's a kind of dialogue that I'll open up with, and then we can, see what the others want to say as they join in. So the big question I have is this. The Sundarbans themselves as the archipelago. Now, obviously, this is a leading question, and you were expecting it from somebody, because unlike the Andamans and the Lakshadweeps, which we dealt with in the previous semesters of this mini-series, the Sundarbans are not evidently an archipelago, right? Now, this is both frustrating and promising. Frustrating because, you have to you can't start at the obvious place, but promising because that means you can make certain moves, right? And so I would love to hear a bit more from you about those moves. What are the ways in which you would consider the Sundarbans to be answerable to an archipelagic epistemology, even more than a topography, right? And then, of course, what can this archipelagic understanding or reading of the Sundarbans do? In terms of the chapters you've given to us, it obviously seems that you can immediately create a corpus in which material from the Sundarbans can sit alongside, say, your reading of narratives around Chagos and all that, and the Andamans. But of course, it would be nice to know, how did you come to that? What prompted you to extend this kind of, in a way, geographic definition or delimitation of an archipelago to include a very interesting and, suggestive sort of space for literature and thinking about environment, etc., from the region, which is the Delta, and all its different valences. So do tell us a little bit about that. A book that I thought which could help you in further, clinching your argument is a book that I spoke about in Paris last week when I was there. This is, of course, I'm mirroring Archipelago of Resettlement, Vietnamese Refugee Settlers and Decolonization Across Guam and Israel-Palestine by Evan L'Espiritu Gandhi. And you must know of this book. You're nodding as you heard me, even saw me lift the book up. And what she does, she uses this idea of nuoc, which is this Vietnamese term for land, water, homeland, everything. It's a very bivalent kind of a term, which in fact configures all these opposites within it. And what she says in her introduction somewhere is that she's also not talking about a literal archipelago. She's talking about all these islands of Vietnamese resettlement all over the world. And she says that it is nuoc that helps her do this reading. And somewhere she says that there's sorry, I'm just trying to find the page. Yes. So, she's basically giving an account of archipelagic studies, which have inspired her. And she says, this book builds on the growing field of archipelagic studies, and she names a lot of them. And then she says, to this scholarship, her book adds an archipelago of resettlement rooted through nuoc. So she's using a kind of understanding of archipelagicity to justify her bringing archipelagic readings to whatever is it that she wants to do with Vietnamese resettlement of refugees. But then also she's saying there's a specific epistemological term from Vietnamese culture, nuance that she's bringing to kind of bring it all together. So, that kind of a move is kind of interesting and I think quite productive. Obviously, and the Sundarbans, you may not be able to use nuance, but you can use things like Mohana, which is about this kind of the space where all the waters meet. And there are all kinds of things one could do as a literary critic, So do tell us if you have thinking in that way already, and, or this could be a way for you to go. The second thing I want to quickly say is the sensorium. I really love the way the sensorium operates in your work. The cuckoo, the bird call, which alerts us to the tidal changes, was a really, I think, clear example for me. But even in the beginning, when you talk about the first person, Hori Bodhi, who wants to have chanachur, and then she's talking about matha jhonjhon and pa kon kon, and these are such evocative terms, in terms of how even the Bengali language sounds in your mouth. That I think this is a way the language enters through onomatopoeia and kind of these words which recall the senses and how the embodiment, the body and the environment are sutured together into the sensorium, which language gives witness to. So I thought this was really superb. And somewhere along the line, you also mentioned vibration, I think. Or there was an idea of things vibrate. Yeah. So, here, another book that I've been reading recently, which I'm finding amazing. This is called The Politics of Vibration by, sorry, everybody's seeing it all upside, in the mirror image. I should do something. Politics of Vibration, Music as a Cosmological Practice by Marcus Boone. So here, Marcus Boone is talking about vibration itself as a sensorial thing. I encourage you to, again, everybody should read this book. It's quite fascinating. He's talking about Indian classical music on the one hand to, Afro-diasporic, house music on the other. It's really revelatory how you bring these together because he's focusing on the ontology, onto-epistemology of vibration. And it seemed to me this chon-chon, matha kon-kon, pa kon-kon, matha, these are all vibratory kind of, appeals to the sensorium. So in all these different ways, really, I wanted to say that there are such interesting pathways for this work to go through, and I really hope that the biggest question that you, I think, will need to attend to, and you are obviously doing that, is how is the Sundarbans becoming archipelagic, and what's the advantage for everybody and everything in doing that? I think is where you obviously will make this chapter fit with the overall dissertation project. But I really enjoyed it. And I think that it's doing a lot of things ambitiously, as I said, bringing out some archives that are very little known, bringing, different registers of the sensorium into the picture, thinking about the environment, thinking about ordinariness, thinking about intimacy. And all this is impelling us to think of the archipelago in a certain way, or you are looking to the archipelago to try and explain everything. So I'll end my response there. I don't know if you want to reply to me right now, or maybe we want to get some other questions on the page as well. So
thank you so much, Dr. Kabir. I mean, this is precisely what I have been thinking about and pretty much going insane trying to find out an answer to this question. I think what I would provisionally say is that I really like how you sort of pointed out how the sensorium features in such crucial ways in the narrative. And so to piggyback to the first question that you have asked, that how is Sundarbans an archipelagic? And I think that the way I see this chapter moving forward is probably through an understanding of the different kind of sensorium of the body, but also of senses of water that I would like to think about. Because, every tidal island has its own way of understanding water and its sound, right? And I think that I find very productive in terms of understanding how it is the sound of water. And more importantly, how is it that sound of water is captured, not exclusively through water per se in the different texts that I am dealing with, which can offer us a way of understanding, what a sense. So how does the sensorium of Sundarbans reshape our understanding of archipelagic criticism.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how I would say it. Like, you asked the question and then you answered yourself, and also like offered me a way to think about it more. But I would say like I need to think more about whether I can do this through literary text in the first place is like another question that I've been grappling with, because I'm in an English department at the end of the day and need to like show in some ways I do literary studies scholarship. So the way I'm thinking about it right now is that maybe I would come back to the vernacular in some form and see what it evokes for me to get at the archipelagic in a more conceptual and epistemological way. But for now, it's the sensorium, it's the sound, it's the texture of water, it's mud in different. I actually do write about the Mohona in terms of dance because I'm also like a whacker, which would hopefully lead to my formulation of the archipelago. But right now, I would like stay a little bit more of the concept of the sound of water and what it means for the different deltaic islands in the place.
That's really helpful. Thank you. There was just one more point that I forgot to mention. I'm just going to sneak it in and then we'll hand over because there are already a few questions in the Q&A box. I thought that since in my conception of archipelagic thinking, it helps us see discontinuities as well as similarities, within a constellation. So I thought that the foxing, the dots on this sounds really very, very banal, but for me, the dots are kind of an archipelagic echo, all these traces on the paper, which foxing produces. And the second thing was that the idea of rupture itself. So when you rupture a continuum, you're obviously creating breaks in the continuum. I mean, the rupture only makes sense because there is something that is not ruptured or not supposed to be ruptured. Ordinary rupture is really interesting because I think for me that's really archipelagic because it is normalizing rupture in a way that an archipelago is a normalized collection of islands. Islands are not continuous. The idea is that there's stuff in between islands. So it is a collection of ruptures or ruptured entities. So maybe this idea of ordinary ruptures also could be marshaled into the service of thinking archipelagically or could line up. But just a kind of...
It's just like, certainly there's a point in my brain, I need to think more about that. Yeah, I'll think about it. I think this is something I've not thought about, to be honest. And I'm going to like reflect more and maybe, hear through the recording once more about what you've just said and sort of just process.
Well, I will now take a back seat, and there are at least 4 questions. Luca, would you like to read them out and
Sure. Yeah, I think we can start with the first one and just proceed as they have arrived in. So the first question is from Samia Roy, who thanks you, and she says that it's always cool listening in, and asks whether you can elaborate a little more on the distinction between environmental and climate change, which is clearly a big question, perhaps, but if you can, share your thoughts. So once again, the distinction between environmental and climate change.
Right. Thank you, Shammu, for the question. And I think I would try to answer that question in 2 ways. One is obviously the question of, temporal. Climate would be a far, like in rough terms, a far bigger scale of time than, let's say, environment, which would probably be a shorter time span. So that's in terms of span. But I think the reason why I made a distinction between environment and climate in the first place at the beginning of my talk is also inspired by something that, Camellia Devan is writing in her book on Misreading the Bengal Delta. So she is basically arguing that on one hand, you have about how change in certain climatic factors, temperature, rise in sea levels or something else is impacting the material conditions that we are living in. And one, the actual physical and material and tangible changes. And one is like climate as a discourse, so that, the work that you are doing can be made legible to the funding body. So for instance, if you're writing, I don't know, a grant application, And, she describes this in a very funny way about how her book is sort of talking about how there is not always a causal relationship between, development projects and the promise that they make about, addressing some of the problems that climate change has caused, because not everything can be eclipsed into the broader rubric of climate change, especially when there are certain local factors that go into playing of the impacts that it can have on people's life that do not necessarily build or count to climate change, but they are more localized and textual factors, right? So one is sort of understanding the material impact and the tangible impact of climate in the ordinary and everyday lives of the people. That's how I would understand environment to be. And one is climate as a discourse that you use to make your work, to make your scholarship legible to people sitting above our head and whatnot. But I think that this distinction is particularly important because it's not just a distinction that humanists make. It is very much a distinction that, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has made in the last few years about, the need to distinguish between environment and climate change. And I can talk more about that, about how this is not just like a humanities intervention, but we do talk about it in a more subtle ways, but even scientists have been talking about the differences in a very huge way in the last few years. Does that make sense? There is no way of understanding if my question got understood or not.
I know, so I was even muting myself. It's a bit complicated, right, when there's no response, even visual, from those who have asked the question, but I believe it does. And if we all agree, we can move on to the second question. There are actually two questions from the same person, Kartik Shankar. And so I would read both of them, but then clearly I'm happy to also repeat them if you can't remember. So first of all, thanks for a fantastic presentation. And the question is, I would love to learn more about fieldwork in literary studies. On the one hand, it seems like fieldwork can better capture the dimensions of ecology, not captured within the text. But does it become even more enmeshed with the question of human and human agency when it seems like that might not exist? That's the first question. So, role of fieldwork in literary studies, especially in the relation with the dimensions of ecology, which can or cannot otherwise be captured within the text. Now, the second question is, where you found the material you're working with.
Yeah, so, well, actually, I would begin with the answer to the second question first, where did I find the material that I'm working with? So there are these local circulating libraries across Bali Islands, and also parts of Kolkata, which are very little known circulating libraries. Sometimes they're environmental non-profits, which has a little library where they have this, collections that you would not otherwise found. So this particular collection that I'm looking at, it comes from the library of an organization called Nature Myths, who has been doing substantial work in Sundarbans for the past, 15 years, 20 years. And there is a lot to be said about, nonprofits working in the Sundarbans. And Loptulia also certainly has, the Nature Myths certainly also has a publication of their own called Loptulia, which is mostly about environment, but not exclusively focused on Sundarbans again. But I think why I wanted to answer this question is because some of these periodicals are also operating in a larger, there is a larger question of social life of letters that is present in the archipelagos. They are doing book donations. They have their own local circulating libraries that they're stocking with books, which also sometimes enables them to, survive in this, market of literary publishing. So maybe not this particular periodical, but another periodical that I'm going to be talking about in the chapter that I did not talk today is, Shudhu Sundarban Charcha, which very much, functions within this broader landscape of the social life of letters in the archipelago. So, perhaps it is these initiatives, community library initiatives, book distribution and initiatives that allows them to, survive and, function. The question about, fieldwork in literary studies, let me just see the question once more and refresh. What was it about? More about, it seems like, capture the dimensions of ecology not captured within the text. Okay, so I would try to understand, try to answer the questions of, the role of fieldwork in literary studies. So I think what fieldwork did for me is that I treat text not through formalist analysis alone, but fieldwork allowed me to make that cross-pollination between what I am seeing and between what I am reading, both within the text and within, the physical material imprint of the deposits on the pages of the periodical itself. And I think had I not done some amount of field work in Sundarbans already, my questions would not have come. So it's not a question of, you have a question and suddenly you go to the field and you have an epiphany about the field and that changes your question. But it is more about how the questions from the field influenced my work on literary studies. It's not that I left literary studies and suddenly became an ethnographer or an anthropologist, but rather it is sort of really trying to understand, okay, what lessons, what kind of experiences have I had in the field that also informs my reading of, literary text. So for instance, when I'm hearing Horibodi, talking about Mata Jhonjhon, Pa Kon Kon, and, that, very physicality of the environment itself, that made me really attuned to maybe, when I'm reading the text, I need to read it for the sensorium because, during my fieldwork, I encountered the environment through the sensorium itself. So how is sensorium present in the text that I'm reading through? So I think those questions about, embodiment, sensorium in the field is what alerted me to reading the text the way I do now. So you can say that it's a form of reading practiced, what my advisor Shalini Puri calls literary fieldwork. But for me, it was like coming to literary studies via some questions that the field raised for me, but not necessarily leaving my own discipline. That's how I would see it.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your answer. Question from Abhishek Visvanathan. Great talk. Could you, yes, Ananya? We cannot hear you.
I saw that Isabel raised her hand as well as asked a question, and I don't know whether that was because she has to leave or something. I'm not sure, but
okay, let's
let you know that I see a hand raised.
Okay, sorry, I can't see hands. So let's maybe read Isabel's question first, and then we can, continue.
We can go back to Abhishek if that's okay.
Yeah. So Isabel Hofmeer, thanks for a great talk. I was wondering, it's Isabel, she was wondering about how one might integrate the first part of the talk on foxing with the second part on the stories themselves. How does one integrate the material and the literary, the inside and the outside of a book? Then she was delighted to hear you using Joshua Calhoun's work and wondered if you could do more with it by thinking about paper and its manufacture. Calhoun talks about paper as a mode in which vegetable, mineral, and animal matter passes through society in textual form. So in essence, the question is about where the paper in the books come from and who made it, and would this reflect on questions of gender and labor? There's much more to say. This is a rather truncated question, but it's a very interesting one.
Thank you for such a great question. And I think part of the puzzle or part of the problem of working with a periodical that is no longer in print is that even though there is I can show you the book here, there's literally, and I know that, you will be seeing it some form, there is an address, there is a phone number, but there is no way I could reach the editors to understand or, interview the editors of this particular periodical because it has gone out of print. So I think that, part of the problems of doing this kind of, material history is also, and especially when working with ephemeral texts that are only there for only a certain period of time, is that there is literally no way I can, maybe there's a way and there's more to talk here. It is kind of difficult to understand where this paper came from or what kind of labor was involved in the making of this paper. Because if I look at the paper, I have no way of saying from which press has come from because I'm not trained in that. And if I was thinking of, getting in touch with, some of the people who have produced this periodical, there is no way either because the address, the phone number, nothing really quite exists anymore. So I think there is like a broader question of methodology here, of the challenges and limits of doing book history today, especially when you're working with an ephemeral text, and there is no way you can reach out to the publisher or people who are contributors to this work anymore. I do that for another periodical that I work with, Shudhu Sundarban Charcha, but I work more with nonfiction on that. But when it comes to the specific periodical, it is a little bit challenging. Maybe there are ways, and I need to think more about it. But for now, where did the paper come from? How did this, book, how it was bound together existed? There is just no way of knowing it because, you see, and this was not done by the publisher, I think this was done by the circulating library to make sure that they don't disappear. So this is how it kind of exists right now, tied all together. And you do not know when the foxing actually happened and how. But thank you for the question. But that is something really provocative, and I need to think more about.
I don't know if you also want to comment on the first part of the question about integrating, how you could integrate in the first part of the talk with the second part on the stories themselves. If you have any comment there.
I feel like that is connected to the question of gender and labor, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah. Okay. So let's move on to Abhishek's question about the tension between legibility and illegibility in literature, about environmental disaster and gender-based violence. Could you say more about this tension, and who does literature not affect or affect?
I think if I write a book, at least my first book someday, I think this is going to be the question that I'm most interested in. How does, as literature scholar, how does aesthetics make certain forms of certain form of environmental violence visible? So for instance, in the book, to the short stories that I referenced, I'm talking about how there is this mention of excess. The fact that, she's being trafficked, or she is, her consent is never asked for in the story. That is not referenced, but it is always through the excess that something which is not explicitly understood through the story makes its presence felt. So the violence itself is not articulated in clear terms, but there are other narrative strategies to work around the violence to talk about it. And that is a very common trope in many literary studies work. I'm pretty sure I'm not the first one to talking about it. I do talk a little bit about it in an essay that I published on shipbreaking literatures in Bangladesh. But I think in the context of Indian Ocean world, the challenge is that on one hand, we are talking about archipelagos, which is a very, topographic understanding, something very, very material, something very, very legible. But at the same time, the Sundarbans is not an archipelago per se. So there is a certain degree of illegibility to that as well. So how does aesthetics sort of, intervene in this question of making something which is supposedly not, legible to the eyes more legible, and legibility to what end? I think that is the second part and the most challenging part of the question. Like, if we are saying we need to make things legible, for whom, why, and what does that legibility achieve? I think that's also something I would like to think more about. That would probably be the conclusion of my dissertation in some form.
I had a quick observation before we get to the next question. I just wanted to say that this idea of the legible also actually is another component of the sensorium. You know, I mean, we don't have to have, we don't need to privilege the optic so much. It can simply be folded into the different kinds of uses we make of our senses, with vision being one of them. And so another way to perhaps address the question would be to return to, to kind of like downgrade our interest in legibility, something that's read, to something, to what about sensing, smelling, touching, tasting, and epistemologies that come out, through those other senses, and then put legibility back in there. We can't do without the legible. Of course, we're dealing with books, but just a passing thought. We've got a couple more questions, I think, Luca. Isabel also said that she would like to do, this is making her think of a project on Indian Ocean paper. So if anyone has any ideas, you know where to go. Luca, over to you, back to you.
Yes,
rather.
We do have a couple of questions from Kalin Daula, who thanks you also for this fascinating talk. Her questions come from her perspective as an ethnographer working in the region. She was especially intrigued by your discussion of caste, gender, and Bombibi. Was there any mention in the short story of growing involvement of Brahmins in Bombibi veneration, since historically many local communities venerated Bombibi directly without mediation of Brahmins? Also, she is wondering if there was any mention of religious minorities, such as Muslims or Christians, in the texts relating to Bombibi, or more generally.
Yes, for the first question, was there any mention in the short story of growing involvement of Brahmins? It is not, again, because the purpose of the stories is to talk more about thinking through gendered violence more. There wasn't a lot about it, but there was definitely a mention where they could offer their prayers to Bombibi only through the Brahmin priest in the temple. So definitely, for the first part of your question, yes. The second part, not that I found in the stories that I have read so far, but I do have actually a lot of material that I have not sorted through yet. So maybe there is something there in that, but from what I have read of the periodicals so far, I haven't come across mention of religious minorities in relation to Bombibi particularly. I mean, there is a lot of scholarship around that, but not specific to the short stories that I found in this periodical, or other kind of there's nonfiction essays too.
Okay, seems that there are no other questions in the Q&A box, unless I am wrong here. Ananya, do you see anything that has not been asked?
No, I think, well, there were amazing questions, and I think Sritama bored through them, with kind of great, you managed to cover all those very, I think, quite difficult questions really adroitly. I'm so happy to see so many people, so many known names and faces in the attendees or from all over the world. It's really nice to see everybody. So we've got about 10 more minutes officially before this is supposed to close. So if anybody has any further questions, do feel free to type them into the box, or at least raise your hand so that we know it's coming.
Can I ask a question to the audience? Because, this is something that I'm still working through. And Ananya, you clearly pointed out some of the things that I need more, I've been thinking through. So if I ask the audience today, what is it that you find compelling about this talk today, like areas that that area you think are really interesting and areas that I could think a little bit more about, that would be really helpful for me as I'm like developing this chapter. So I don't know if there is a comment or if there's like a Q&A section where you can just write what you found compelling or areas that need work. That would be really helpful for me as I develop this chapter. So this is like an open invitation to the audience. You don't have to write it right now. If you want, you can, please. But also like you can write to me personally and like just let me know about, some of these questions are like what you found interesting and areas that you think certainly could do a little bit more thinking with. I've gone to the stage where I'm asking a question to the audience.
Well, this is what we call a conversation. So of course, if this were a physical room in which everybody were present, it would be much easier in a way, but you could see from the body language who was getting ready to respond to you or not. But absolutely, everyone here, it's obviously a community of like-minded scholars. So I'm sure people can also, get in touch with you if they want to, and I'm sure that they all know how to do that.
As we wait for maybe
you had some questions. You had some questions.
Sorry.
Luca.
I do have some of which have already been answered, or in any case, the answer has already been pointed to, or the absence of a possible answer. So I won't ask these. But I do have, again, as we wait for maybe some feedback, if there's any, from the audience, I want to sort of, it's not a simple possibly question, but one that starts from here, but also looks at your research project, dissertation project in general, because you do work for your dissertation not only on the Sundarbans but on Chagos and the Andamans. Is the Andamans, right? The other region that, yes. But in your project you were mentioning archipelagic writing, right? I mean, you define something as archipelagic writing. So as an impression, as you continue writing your dissertation, how would you differently define, what is your different idea of archipelagic writing when you think about the writing that comes from the Sundarbans, as opposed to the writings that you have analyzed from the Chagos or the Andamans? Are you able, or are you trying? Are you interested in providing a definition, like an all-encompassing, so to say, definition of what archipelagic writing may be, that sort of reunites, that keeps together all of the elements that you are able to connect from these three different regions? Or how do you inflect your idea of archipelagic writing differently when you analyze your three different sites of fieldwork?
Part of the richness of Indian Ocean textual cultures is that it is not even possible to have to me, at least, not even possible to have an overarching idea of Indian Ocean ordinary ruptures, because each of the archipelagos has different historical realities and material conditions that we are working in. So for instance, Chagos, the writers that I'm looking at, I love their work, but how do you write about a place you've never been there? Because you're literally offshore, you're not allowed to enter Chagos, right? Whereas, the text that I'm dealing with when it comes to Sundarbans, they're like very local texts written by people, some of whom are from the region itself. So obviously there's a different understanding of materiality and history there altogether. I can do certain amount of fieldwork in Andamans, in Sundarbans, same thing I cannot do when it comes to Chagos. So it's not just the text that I'm dealing with, but my experiences as a researcher in the field that also influences the way I read, or the interpretative moves I make when I come to reading this text. So for instance, in Chagos, because I just completed writing that chapter, there is an iconic image of the Nordwehr, which is the boat which kind of deported the the Chagosians in 1973. So there is a lot of images and writing about ships and boats in literature. But one of the interesting things that in one of the literary texts that I look at, the boats, right, the boats do for me is to think about migrant poetics differently, or because it has a history of displacement and migration. Whereas for Underbans, I'm thinking through the history of incarceration. I'm thinking through displacement of not displacement, but continuous neocolonial violence in the Underbans in various ways. And so, for instance, even the genres that I look at in each of the chapters are different. One is the periodical. In another chapter, I'm looking at a novel. And then there are also like short stories and poetry that I'm looking in chagos. So each of the genre has its own way of understanding ordinary aesthetics. So it's very difficult to have this one overarching idea of what constitutes ordinary aesthetics. What I can certainly think about is that what understanding of radicalism does this various notions of ordinariness present, and that can be my way to link methodologically the different historical and cultural contexts of the archipelagos. But otherwise, I just think if somebody can do that, it's great, but I don't think such a unitary coherence in terms of what is ordinary aesthetics is even possible.
Sure. Great. Thank you. Thank you. Especially I look forward to maybe there's a chance to have you on board for a chagos, given that you've already written that chapter, to share that with us soon as well. So some feedback has arrived in the Q&A box, but maybe I will leave it for you to take and take back from this seminar. Vignesh maybe can confirm that the Q&A, I think, will be we will keep it will be possible to have the text of that for future reference. So
if it's just
otherwise,
do you just need the questions or the comments as well?
Yeah. Okay. In many cases, just in the questions, but I will take a picture just in case it we lose it somewhere. So I think if there are no other questions and these are more feedback, we can finish here on this on this line. Thank you so much, Sritama, for a wonderful presentation, very interesting. And I would like to remind everybody that this was recorded, so there will be a recording out on YouTube in around a week or so. It will be advertised surely by all of us, but at the very least, it will be advertised in the Twitter account of the India and the Indian Ocean Marie Curie project. In terms of the seminar, we will have our next seminar will be in a month to this day, 14th of March, always on the Sundarbans, and we will have Kalin Dowler, who, by the way, asked you a question today, presenting us a different perspective on the Sundarbans from an ethnographical point of view. That also has already been advertised on the King's India Institute pages, so you can check the link for that session and also the abstract. So once again, Sritama, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation, and all the best to you, and thank you to everybody who was here today attending Sritama's talk.